Okay, so as Joseph said, I'm going to talk a little bit about metrics, some of the current ones and some of the ones that are emerging. I'll give some definitions. I'll talk about some of the data sources that the existing metrics use, and I'll drill into a couple of those in a little bit more detail. I'll also talk about some of the new sources of data that we now have access to, and some of the new metrics that have been devised that use these sources of data. And then I'll talk just a little bit about some of the implications for editors of all of this stuff. So a bit about AJET first of all. So AJET is the Australasian Journal of Educational Technology. I'm one of 3 lead editors of AJET. AJET is published by the Australasian Society for Computers and Learning in Tertiary Education, or ASCILITE. It's a free open access journal with no publication charges, so I'm Rory's best mate, and not Nick's. We draw on some funds from the ASCILITE Association to allow us to pay copy editors and web hosting charges, I guess, so we're lucky in that respect. If we didn't have that, we might have to be Nick's best mate and not Rory's. Now, the journal has historically been a broad educational technology journal. Since 2013, following a review of the journal led by ASCILITE, it shifted its focus to be solely post-school education. And there are 3 lead editors. Just in terms of the size of the journal, I guess, or the size of the operation, I guess I've put the numbers up there. We had about 450 submissions in 2014, and we publish around about 50 articles a year, so a fair bit of production work there. Okay, so that's my kind of editing background. So let's have a talk about bibliometrics. So according to Wikipedia, bibliometrics is statistical analysis of written publications such as books or articles, including they're used to provide quantitative analysis of academic literature. Typically, citation analysis is one of the most common aspects of this, and it's used for a range of different purposes to measure the impact of researchers or the impact of a particular paper. And I didn't go and edit the Wikipedia definition, but if I had time, I would have added the impact of journals, which is what we're talking about today. So the basic data that bibliometrics have tended to draw on, I guess, include the number of articles submitted. So when we're measuring the performance of a journal or an author, we can talk about the number of articles that have been submitted and the number of articles published. And then when we're talking about individual articles or authors or journals, we can talk about the number of views of the abstract of an article or a group of articles, and we can talk about the number of downloads of the full, usually PDF, of an article, and then most importantly, I guess, the number of citations, and by that we mean the number of times other published papers have included this particular article in their reference list. So that's what we mean by a citation. So some of the common journal measures or metrics that kind of draw on that basic set of data. Journal acceptance rate is one that people use as a measure of quality. So journals that accept the large majority of the papers that are submitted are generally assumed to be lower quality. Of course, it is dependent on the quality of what's submitted. This is a difficult one because often journals don't make that available, or at least they don't make the data that it's dependent on available. So you can't kind of treat it in a completely transparent way because there's some ambiguity depending on editorial processes. For example, do you count every article submitted and then compare that to the number published, or do you only include the articles that are sent out for peer review and not include articles that were perhaps rejected editorial because they were perhaps sent to the wrong journal or found to be unsuitable for some reason? A second measure is just journal article downloads, nothing fancy about that. But they're not always reliable measures because of the fact that a lot of journals exist on their own website, but also in various databases and repositories. And so sometimes you're provided with the data from other databases so that you can kind of pull that together to work out the downloads of an article. But it's not always possible to see how many downloads have occurred in repositories like ResearchGate or even institutional repositories. So article download statistics are often difficult to get in a reliable way. So one of the most common journal metrics, it's changed its name a few times over the years. Its current name is the Thomson Reuters Journal Citation Reports Impact Factor, or Impact Factor for short. There's a 2-year impact factor and a 5-year impact factor. And I'm going to unpack that one in a little bit more detail in a minute, but that's probably the most common one that people refer to in terms of the quality of a journal. The Google Scholar H-index and H-medium are newer measures, and they've only been out in the last year or so, but I want to go into those in a bit more detail as well, because I like the idea of including one of the kind of closed commercial measures and one of the kind of open measures, just to kind of show that we've got a few different ways that we can get access to the data. Of course, Google are commercial, but they're commercial and open. Some of the less common journal metrics, but which are nevertheless important and they're used commonly for certain purposes. There's a couple of Scopus measures. The source normalised impact per paper is an interesting one because it's actually a weighted measure, weighted according to subject area. Those that read across various disciplines would be aware that, for example, in the medical discipline, impact factors around, anywhere from 12 up to 20 are quite common, meaning that the average article is being cited in other papers, 12 to 20 times, whereas in education, it's much more common for impact factors around the 1 to 2 mark, or even lower than 1, which means the average article is being cited, 1 or 2 or less times. So the source normalised impact per paper corrects for those different citation practices across disciplines so that you can then compare the citation measure in one discipline with the citation measure in another. Now, there are differences of opinion over whether that's a sound thing to do, because perhaps the citation numbers in the different disciplines reflect the actual citation practices of those disciplines, and perhaps a higher number is actually a higher quality, and therefore to normalise that is to kind of artificially correct. So there's some debate there. The Scopus Sci-Maggio Journal Rank, or SJR, is another measure that has a weighting according to the subject field, but it also has a weighting according to the quality of the citing journals. So journals that have a high SNIP would be weighted, if there's a reference from an article in that journal back to the article in the target journal, then that would be weighted more highly in terms of the overall rank, so that references from higher quality sources rate more highly. And I guess intuitively that sounds, like it might be sound, but the more complicated the measure, the harder it is to kind of intuitively understand what it means, and the more worrying it might be that you're putting a lot of weighting on this measure without really understanding how it's calculated. So one argument is go with the simpler ones, because at least you know what their limitations are rather than the more complicated ones. So the other one I wanted to mention is the eigenfactor and article influence metric, which are journal ranking measures based on analysis of an article's centrality within the network formed by articles and citations within articles. So that's a bit complicated. But if you think about a kind of a graph, a network that shows nodes which are articles and links that represent references within that article to other articles and so on, and so that we have this massive network of articles and their references. Within that network, articles that are regularly referenced by other articles are going to be more central within that network, and articles that are referenced by other highly cited articles are also going to be more central within that network. So in a sense, you get a higher score if firstly, your article is highly referenced, but secondly, it's referenced by other articles which are highly referenced and so on. So you can kind of see, follow the trail to see which articles are the most important to the field using those measures. So they're interesting ones. They're not used a great deal, but I think there's a certain intuitive soundness to that kind of measure. They're not pushed by any of the publishing companies, and this is why the Scopus and Thomson Reuters measures are the ones that are most commonly used, because certain publishing companies align themselves with those measures and promote them on their website, so they become the kind of norm in terms of the things that people report, and they build their own momentum. So I wanted to just explain in a little bit more detail one of these measures, just to kind of give a better understanding of how they work and the kinds of drilling down that you might do as a journal editor or as a discerning author. So I'm going to look at the Thomson Reuters impact factor. When we see the term impact factor, it usually refers by default to the 2-year impact factor, but there's also a 5-year impact factor. And I've given the definition of the 5-year one there. The definition of the 2-year one is the same, but based on 2 years. So essentially the 5-year impact factor is the average number of citations for all articles published in a particular journal from articles in the current year. So when I say the current year, the most recent year that the Thomson Reuters impact factor data is available, I think we're still on 2013. So 2013 impact factor is essentially, it looks at all of the articles published in 2013 that are in that database. Not all journals are in that database. So all of the articles published in that year, and the references within those articles to articles published in AJET, for example, in the past 5 years before that. And then you add up that total number of references to AJET articles in that 5-year period, and then you divide by the total number of articles published in AJET in that period. So essentially you're getting the average number of citations per article from articles published in the current year. So it gives you a kind of a measure of the impact that articles in AJET are currently having on the field, I guess. And the 2-year one is the most recent 2 years of articles. So it's a much more kind of current measure and therefore more fluctuating. There's no real bias in favour of high or low volume journals through this measure, because whether you publish 200 articles a year or whether you publish 20 articles a year, it's still based on the kind of average number of citations per article. So increasing the volume and decreasing the quality can have a detrimental effect on the impact factor. So you want to if you want to keep the impact factor high, then the best way to do that is to keep the quality of the articles high and not publish things that are not likely to be cited. So if you look at the league tables, I guess, for the impact factor, and I've highlighted a couple of the journals that are represented here today or in the earlier session we had this morning. You can see that in educational technology, the best is Computers and Education at 2.6 citations per article for articles published in the past 2 years from articles published in 2013, and it kind of works its way down. Most of us are hovering around the 1. AJET was slightly ahead of BJET the previous year. We use BJET as a bit of a benchmark, so we try and keep ahead of them, but we've slipped behind for a year because we had a couple of highly cited papers that slipped out of the time window of the 2-year measurement, and that put us down. And I think a couple of the editors of our journal have published a couple of highly cited articles in BJET, which has lifted their scores.
You win some, you lose some.
That's all right. Just to show you the sort of drilling down that you can actually do, this is the kind of report that you get when you go to your journal database within your library system in order to kind of find out a bit more information about the impact factor. You get your kind of basic 2-year and 5-year impact factor. You get a fair bit of background information about the journal. You drill down a bit further, it actually shows you the actual raw numbers of papers that were cited in each year, and so you can see how the numbers are actually calculated, because it tells you how many there were each year and works out the averages there. You can also drill in and find out which other journals cited articles in AJET, and you can go the other way as well. And then through the Web of Science database, you can actually go in and find out which articles were the most cited, and then you can actually follow the chain to see which articles cited those most cited articles. So that can be kind of useful. You know, this was one of the most cited articles in AJET in 2012, which is within the publishing window, and you can see that it's an article about student perceptions of Facebook. So you think, okay, well, that's probably a hot topic. So you might say, oh, well, let's see if we can encourage some more submissions on the use of Facebook for learning, because maybe that's a hot topic and we'll earn lots of citations and boost our impact factor. Maybe we could commission a special issue on the use of social media for learning. That would be a kind of more thorough strategy to try and get some articles in that particular area. So you can kind of see how the thinking can evolve. Okay, so the other one I wanted to drill down to a little bit is the Google Scholar H-index. Now, a lot of us would be familiar with the H-index as a score for an individual person's publication record, and the logic and the calculation is the same for journals. They use the H5 index and H5 median. The H5 index is the largest number H, such that H articles published in that 5-year time period have at least H citations. Now, that's kind of tricky language to dissect, but if, for example, you have a journal with that has 20 articles that have 20 or more citations during that 5-year period, and the next most cited article only has 19, then the H5 index would be 20. But as soon as that next most cited article lifts up to 21 citations, then there are now 21 articles that have got 21 or more. No, the 21 has to lift as well. So those bottom two lift up a couple, then you raise the H5 index up to 21. So the key thing with the Google Scholar H5 index is that there's a bias in favour of journals with high publication outputs. Obviously, if you're publishing 400 articles a year, then it's much easier to have 20 out of that 400 that have 20 or more citations, whereas if you're publishing only 40 articles a year, then you would need half of your articles to have 20 or more citations to get to a H5 index as 20. And so it's also not affected by an increase in publication of lower quality articles. So if this was the only measure that you were focusing on, you might just accept everything and let the readership decide which are the better quality articles and which ones to cite, because you're not penalised for low impact articles. Whereas with the Thomson Reuters impact factor, you very much are penalised for low quality articles. So you can see how you can kind of, your editorial practices could be steered in different directions depending on which kinds of metrics you were focusing on increasing. So there's the league table for the Google Scholar H5 index, and you can see that a larger number of the journals that are represented here have high indexes on this measure. So I guess we're a lot more online, so we do better on the kind of online database of Google Scholar rather than the sort of hidden closed database of Thomson Reuters. Again, BJET ahead of AJET on that one as well, but Computers and Ed still ahead, and obviously Computers and Ed, those that are familiar with the field would know that Computers and Ed have drastically increased their volume of publication over the past 3 or 4 years, and no surprise that as a result they've got a high H5 index. And again, through Google Scholar's metrics, you can drill in and look at particular subject areas, in this case educational technology, and the nice thing that you can do with this is that you can then click on the number of citations next to a particular journal, and it'll take you in and show you those articles, and you can see their number of citation. You can again make a bit of a judgment about the kinds of things that are highly cited, and you can see there's one here that's focusing on Web 2 software. So again, that Facebook and social media seems to be coming up as something that leads to high citations, or at least in that kind of period of 2010 to 12, that was the case. Might be old hat now, so I don't want to do a special issue on Facebook and no one's interested. Okay, so there's a few changes to this whole territory that are interesting at the moment. So there's new types of data that are becoming available. Tools like ResearchGate, for example, are providing new ways to access articles. So requests for articles through ResearchGate, for example, could be a new piece of data we could use in a metric. Social media mentions on things like Facebook and Twitter provides another source of information about interest from the community in articles. Social media likes, mentions in the news media provides a broader kind of measure of the impact that an article is having beyond academia. Recommendations through some kinds of social media systems, web links to articles could be also included, and bookmarks in things like Cite You Like. So all of these different measures can be used, and there's a number of new metrics that are coming out that are using some or all of these measures. A general term that tends to be used for them is altmetrics, but that's becoming a bit tricky now because there's a company called altmetric.com, and if we want to refer generically to altmetrics, it's kind of confusing because of that company, so maybe just alternative metrics. Some people refer to them as article level metrics, but of course impact factor there are other article level metrics that, you know, the number of citations to an article, which are not really in this category of alternative metrics. So altmetrics is a article level metric, but it can be pulled at the journal or author level. Impact story is another, and Plum Analytics. They're just some of the ones. And some of the commercial publishers are now starting to display some of these altmetrics on their pages. The problem is there's still there's a lot of complexity because a lot of them are using a number of different measures and they're kind of changing the formulas. There's trickiness because you can game them a little bit by kind of getting your friends to go on and you know, mention them on Facebook. So there's scope for kind of distorting the data. So why all this fuss about metrics, I guess? You know, are we interested? Is it just something that our masters, I think Nick said, are interested in, or should we be interested in them as either editors, reviewers, authors, or readers of journals? So I guess authors want to publish in journals with high bibliometric ratings, and one of the reasons for that is that it's an indirect measure of the quality of an article. I've seen people within grant applications, instead of actually reporting the number of citations that a particular article they've written has, they instead present the impact factor of the journal. So they're sort of saying, well, this journal tends to be highly cited, so it's a high quality journal, therefore this is a good article because it's in a good quality journal. So that's a kind of common thing for people to do. So that's a reason for publishing in a high impact journal. Journals with high downloads or high readership are attractive because obviously if we're, you know, whatever our motivation, if we're doing research, we want it to be read by a lot of people. And, you know, BJET is well known to be one of the journals with the biggest circulation out there. So if you want to get your work read, might not be cited because it might not be of interest to people, but the first step is to have it read. And of course, journals with high citation rates give you some confidence of the likelihood of an article's citation. So if the impact factor of a journal is high, well, what that tends to say is that regardless of how many people are reading articles in that journal, they're tending to read and cite the articles. So perhaps that journal is read by genuine scholars who are actually going to do something with the work they read and go on and cite it. So again, you might be more confident that your article will be cited if you publish it in a journal with a high impact factor. Journal publishers, whether they're commercial bodies or societies or universities that are funding journals, want to be confident in the reputation of the journal because they want to be confident that they're not wasting their money. And so they're looking for any kind of measure of the quality of the articles published in a journal. So what are the implications of all of this for journal editors? What can an editor do to lift the citation performance of a journal? Well, for some measures, increasing the publication volume, that is the quantity of articles published, can increase the metrics, but as I showed, that can also decrease other metrics. Decreasing the volume of low quality articles through editorial or peer review processes. So if you create a kind of a stricter editorial review process or a stricter set of guidelines for peer review, then that will hopefully get rid of some lower quality, lower impact articles if you can predict those things. But of course, often the most methodologically sound and theoretically deep articles that get fantastic ratings by reviewers are too complex for the average readership and go uncited. I know in my own case, the stuff of mine that has been the most cited has often been the review papers rather than the really gutsy empirical research, and that's just the kind of nature of the field. So just having rigorous review processes doesn't necessarily result in high citations. So targeting articles in areas likely to result in citation through invitations to submit, or more commonly through targeted special issues, or identifying accepted articles that are likely to be highly cited and moving them closer to the front of the publication queue. We certainly don't do that in AJET. We publish articles in the order that they're accepted, but I am confident that there are journals that do that kind of promoting of articles up the queue because they think this is a really timely submission. We think this is going to be really interesting to people. So how do you identify articles that are likely to be cited? Well, content analysis of published articles is one way that you could do that. Maybe analysing the author's publication record. So, I mean, I've never heard of anyone doing that, but theoretically you could kind of start to target in on authors that you think have been highly cited before and trying to, encourage them to submit. We did a little bit of an analysis of AJET's most cited articles just in terms of analysing the category of articles. And we found that some of the most cited articles tended to be those review papers or case studies rather than the, say, experimental kinds of studies. But that's not an exhaustive review. And it'd be interesting to see some more thorough kind of work in that area. I think there has been some kinds of work done. So just a couple of cautions to finish off with. Citations only show the academic impact of articles. So articles that have a really major impact on the profession, whether it's the higher ed teaching profession or the school teaching profession, for example, that might not necessarily be highly cited because sometimes the impact occurs in other ways rather than through the kind of academic citation of publications. Journal citation indices are only helpful for exploring the average impact or the impact of leading articles in a journal. If you want to figure out what the impact of a particular article is, it's much more important to see how many times the article itself has been cited rather than the kind of average citation for that journal. So, much more important if you're trying to promote the quality of your publication output in your grant applications to actually focus on, how much your work is cited. And a lot more work is needed on alt metrics before they can really be relied upon. So conclusions, as editors we need to be aware of the metrics used by our stakeholders, and we need to understand how those metrics are calculated so that we can have a more sophisticated understanding of the kind of implications of our editorial decisions on the metrics. We don't want to be driven by the metrics, but we also don't want to do things that are going to have a detrimental effect on the metrics without knowing that it is going to have a detrimental effect. And there may be actions that we can take that are quite consistent with our overall quality publication mission, but which will also increase our citation rates. And having special issues on topics that our readers are interested in, that's a valuable thing to do in any case, but it should also increase the performance on metrics. And I think that's all I've got time for.
Thank you very much, Barney.